It was a cold October night when Frank set out on the long haul from Dallas to Chicago. He had made this trip hundreds of times before without incident, but this time felt different. As he merged onto the highway, the full moon overhead cast an eerie glow on the darkened landscape. With 500 miles of open road ahead, Frank settled in for the long, lonely night of driving. Little did he know the terror that awaited him out there in the darkness. Frank turned up the radio to keep him company through the monotonous night. He hummed along absent-mindedly to a familiar tune, the music unable to fully distract him from the isolation of the open highway. Not a soul could be seen for miles in either direction at this late hour. The dotted yellow lines of the highway stretched on endlessly towards the horizon, swallowed up by the darkness. As the hours passed uneventfully, Frank began to grow drowsy behind the wheel. Just as Frank's eyelids grew heavy, a light flashed in his rearview mirror. Another truck was approaching quickly from behind. Frank sat up straight, suddenly alert as the truck roared past him, missing his bumper by mere inches. He caught a glimpse of writing on the back door as it whizzed by, but it was gone before he could make out what it said. Uneasy, Frank changed lanes to allow plenty of space between him and the erratic truck driver. Up ahead, Frank spotted a rest stop and decided to pull over for some coffee. As he parked the truck, the other semi pulled in as well. Frank watched warily as a gaunt, bearded man in a flannel shirt climbed out of the cab. Their eyes met briefly before the stranger turned and headed toward the rest stop building. Frank felt a chill run down his spine, unsure why the man's presence unsettled him so. Shaking it off, he headed inside for a much-needed coffee refill. Back on the highway, Frank kept checking his mirrors nervously, half expecting to see the mysterious truck reappear behind him. The miles of pitch darkness and isolation preyed on his nerves. He flipped on the radio again, searching for a station to keep him company, but all he heard was static. After endless twisting and turning of the dial yielded nothing, he snapped it off in frustration. It was then he noticed the strange odor, a sickly, sweet, decaying smell that seemed to cling to the inside of the cab. Frank rolled down the windows, hoping the rush of cold night air would eliminate the stench. But if anything, the smell grew stronger, almost overpowering in its putrid sweetness. Frank began to feel ill, his stomach churning and head throbbing. He longed for the familiar glow of city lights on the horizon, but he was still hours from Chicago. As the awful smell worsened, Frank realized to his horror that it was emanating from the trailer of his truck. But what could possibly be back there emitting such a nauseating odor? Pulling over at the next chance he got, Frank knew he had to investigate the source of the smell. Leaving the cab running, he walked cautiously along the side of the trailer. He hesitated as he reached for the door handle, fearing what might be waiting inside. The stench was overpowering now, like rotten, decaying flesh. Holding his breath, Frank tugged open the trailer door and flipped on the light inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, strewn across the floor of the trailer, were the butchered remains of human bodies. Frank recoiled in horror. Shock rooted him temporarily frozen to the spot. Hacked up limbs, torn flesh, congealed blood were scattered haphazardly around the trailer. The sickly, sweet stench was overpowering now, choking Frank as he grasped the door to keep himself from collapsing. After what felt like an eternity, Frank stumbled back to the cab and fumbled for his phone to call 911. But just as Frank's shaking hand grabbed the phone, a sudden tapping at the passenger side window made his heart nearly stop. Whipping his head around, he saw the bearded trucker from the rest stop, leering in at him. The man's gaunt face was expressionless, his dark, sunken eyes cold and hollow. Slowly, he raised one bony finger and dragged it menacingly across his own throat while holding Frank's petrified gaze. Letting out a strangled cry, Frank fumbled desperately to slam the truck into gear and stomp the gas pedal to the floor. He had to get away from this murderous lunatic no matter what. The tires squealed as the semi lurched forward, spewing dust and gravel as it left the sinister stranger behind. Frank's mind reeled, his horrified thoughts racing as fast as his pounding pulse. Had that hollow-eyed psycho put the butchered bodies in his trailer? Was he sent to permanently silence the only witness to his horrific crimes? Frank's heart hammered against his ribs, hands slippery with cold sweat on the wheel, as the truck roared onwards into the night. He was too terrified to slow down even an inch, convinced he had to keep going until he reached the safety of the city. Miles later, with the needle buried deep in the red, Frank raced onwards, fueled only by pure adrenaline. The sickly stench still filled the cab, inescapably lingering like a constant chilling reminder of the gruesome cargo in the back. But now ahead in the distance, the Chicago skyline shone on the horizon, filling Frank with desperate relief. Once inside the city limits, he could alert the authorities and this hellish nightmare would finally be over. White-knuckled on the wheel, eyes darting constantly to the mirrors, he watched for any sign of headlights bearing down behind him. At long last, heart still pounding from terror, Frank passed beneath the familiar Chicago city limits sign. He breathed a deep sigh of relief, beyond grateful to be back among the living after the harrowing events of the night. As he steered the truck towards the depot, he could hardly wait to be rid of the grisly, rotting cargo in the trailer. He desperately tried to push the gruesome images from his mind, praying the authorities could somehow make sense of the unspeakable horrors he had witnessed. For now, bathed in welcoming city lights, he was just thankful to have escaped that isolated highway of terror with his life. But the shadowy, gripping fear of that sinister, bearded trucker would linger over Frank for a very long time. Still reeling from the bone-chilling, traumatic events of the night, Frank pulled his rumbling semi into the depot parking lot, just as the first rays of dawn were breaking over Chicago. He staggered weakly out of the cab on unsteady, shaky legs, desperate to get as far away as humanly possible from the grisly, rotting cargo in his trailer. As he slowly made his way across the lot towards the depot office, he tried in vain to wipe the haunting image of the wild-eyed, bearded man and his cold, hollow eyes from his mind. After being awake for over 24 tense, harrowing hours, Frank was mentally and physically exhausted. But through the fog of fatigue, he knew he urgently needed to alert the authorities before that murderous lunatic could somehow track him down again. Inside the small, dingy depot office, Frank frantically explained in vivid detail the macabre discovery in his trailer to the dispatcher on duty. Though initially skeptical of Frank's bizarre, unbelievable account, the dispatcher immediately called Chicago PD once the first patrol cars arrived and the trailer doors creaked open. The hardened officers reeled back in horror upon seeing the nightmarish scene. Countless hacked up, dismembered body parts and decomposing limbs strewn haphazardly across the entire trailer floor. The overpowering stench of decay overwhelmed the officers, causing several to double over and vomit as they scrambled to cordon off the entire loading dock. This was no longer just a routine call. It was clear now that a profoundly disturbed, maniacal killer was on the loose. While anxiously waiting to give his official recorded statement, Frank's mind raced uncontrollably as he agonized over how the mutilated bodies ended up hidden in his trailer. He had stopped at several rest areas to refuel along his route that night. Had that hollow-eyed, bearded freak slipped into his unlocked trailer and hidden the bodies during one of those stops? Or even worse, could Frank have possibly been unknowingly transporting those poor, slaughtered souls over hundreds of miles in the back of his rig the entire drive from Dallas? A fresh wave of nausea washed over him as he imagined the deranged butcher secretly stowing his victims right under his nose, working just feet away to dismember them in the trailer. Hours later, completely drained both emotionally and physically from recounting every chilling detail to the police, all Frank wanted was to go straight home and barricade himself securely inside. But when he wearily shuffled up to his front door and entered his house, his blood instantly turned to ice. The entire place had been completely ransacked, furniture slashed and overturned, belongings ripped open and strewn everywhere, windows smashed in. It was painfully clear that someone had methodically searched the place looking for something specific. As his pulse pounded in his ears, Frank realized with dawning dread that it could only have been one person responsible. The maniacal bearded trucker had already tracked him down to silence him forever. Frank knew there was no way he could stay there another minute. The crazed trucker was likely still lurking somewhere nearby, watching the house, biding his time before striking again. Hands shaking, Frank grabbed his keys off the kitchen counter and got back into his pickup, peeling out of the driveway. He needed to get somewhere. Anywhere. To lay low for a while until the police finally caught the deranged psycho killer who had shattered his nerves. After agonizing over where to possibly go, Frank decided fleeing upstate to his cousin's remote, secluded cabin was his best option. Surely no one would ever find him there. It was his only real shot at buying time for his frayed panic to subside before he could even begin to mentally process getting behind the wheel of a semi-truck again. The anxious drive to the cabin was pure torment for Frank's rattled mind. Every single pair of headlights that appeared in his rearview mirror made his pulse quicken and muscles tense as he imagined the remorseless killer chasing him down again. Gripping the wheel white-knuckled, he drove erratically and much too fast, wanting to put as many miles between himself and the city as humanly possible. Only once the bright glow of Chicago's skyline had faded into pitch darkness in his back mirror could Frank finally breathe a small sigh of relief. Out here alone in the middle of nowhere, surely he was safe from that maniac at long last. Arriving at the cabin, Frank's frayed nerves had him jumping at even the smallest noises, tree branches scraping on the roof, the wind whistling around the eaves. Like a man possessed, he frantically barricaded himself inside, drawing all the curtains and double-checking that every door and window was locked up tight. With each passing hour spent hidden away, his panic gradually began to subside, knowing there was no way the killer could have followed him this far into the wilderness. Yet gruesome visions of those severed limbs and the hollow-eyed stranger still plagued his thoughts relentlessly. He tossed and turned in fitful spurts all night long, grateful when morning's light finally crept in through the windows. After spending 3 straight sleepless, paranoid nights there at the cabin, Frank finally decided he had to return to the city soon. He couldn't hide away from reality forever. The authorities had likely tracked down the deranged killer and arrested him by now after such a huge investigation. He was desperate for any possible updates on the case, any assurances that the bearded man was securely behind bars and no longer posed a threat. Mustering his courage, Frank steeled himself for the dreaded drive back, trying to convince his frayed nerves that the police surely had things under control after all this time. Arriving back on the outskirts of Chicago, Frank was shocked to see squad cars still surrounding his trailer at the depot, cops combing it for any possible forensic evidence. He learned to his horror that the killer was somehow still at large. There had been absolutely zero breaks in the investigation so far. Now the police had Frank under constant surveillance in case the maniac returned to permanently silence the sole living witness. But even with all their resources, they seemed no closer to any answers about the killer's twisted motives or victims, let alone apprehending the lunatic. In an attempt to regain some sense of normalcy, Frank hesitantly attempted to carry on working, taking short local delivery jobs around the Chicago area. But being back out on the open road filled him with a nameless, paralyzing dread. He found himself constantly pulling over to frantically check that the trailer doors were securely locked and chained. Gripping the wheel white-knuckled, he drove uneasily, compulsively scouring every passing rest stop and parking lot for any sign of the wild-eyed, bearded man. With each job, Frank's anxiety worsened until he finally outright refused to drive any semi-routes at all, plagued by traumatic flashbacks. As the weeks dragged on, there were still no meaningful breaks in the investigation. Each night, without fail, the chilling face of the bearded man haunted Frank's restless nightmares, always lurking just out of sight, forever beyond his reach. Frank slowly came to the painful realization that he would never feel safe on a highway again until the deranged killer was finally caught once and for all. But clearly, the police were utterly helpless in tracking the maniac down. At long last, Frank knew he had to take matters into his own hands. It was time to turn the tables and do the unthinkable. He would hunt the hunter. Frank began deliberately driving back and forth along the desolate Dallas-Chicago route where the nightmare had all started, hoping to finally lure the psychopath out of hiding. He pushed the semi to reckless, dangerous speeds, brazenly welcoming any chance the maniac might rear his head again. Alone in the pitch darkness once more, Frank's fraying mind actually hoped for another confrontation with the monster. He knew facing his tormentor was the only possible way to reclaim any sense of power and sanity. This time, he would be ready. 2 agonizing weeks passed with no sign of his target. Then, pulling into a familiar rest stop outside St. Louis to refuel, a chill ran down Frank's spine. There, parked casually next to his truck, was an all-too-familiar bearded man. Frank's chest tightened, pulse instantly racing as their eyes briefly met. This was the moment he had been waiting for. After being the hunted for so long, it was finally time for him to make the killer the prey. Tonight would be the end, for better or worse. Frank quietly slipped a tire iron from the back of his cab, gripping the cold steel tightly to stop his hands from shaking. He slowly began creeping up unseen behind the unsuspecting man, each step filling his veins with adrenaline. His last shreds of reason urged him to run, but the thirst for revenge drowned it out. Approaching within striking distance, Frank raised the iron high above his head, readying a brutal blow with every ounce of rage in his body. But just as he swept down with all his might, the man spun around with inhuman speed and caught Frank's arm in an iron vice grip. The tire iron clattered to the ground as the man fixed Frank with his cold, hollow eyes. His face broke into a sadistic grin as he effortlessly forced Frank to his knees. Frank struggled against the vice-like grip, but the man was inhumanly strong. As he stared up into the dark, bottomless eyes of the killer, Frank pleaded desperately for his life. But his cries fell on deaf ears. The man wrapped his powerful hands around Frank's throat and began mercilessly choking the life from him. Frank frantically clawed and scratched at the man's arms, drawing blood, but it did nothing to loosen the unbreakable stranglehold. As the last bits of air wheezed from his lungs, Frank's bulging eyes remained locked on the bearded face of his killer. The man took obvious delight in slowly draining the life from his victim. Just before the world faded to black, Frank's gaze fell upon the back of the man's jacket. Faded writing that he had not noticed before came into focus. Illinois State Coroner's Office. As the chilling realization dawned on him, a final panicked gurgle escaped Frank. The reports were wrong. This was no random, deranged killer. This monster had access to the bodies, the resources to move them undetected, the inside knowledge to hunt Frank down. The man staring back at him with delight as he choked the life away was no trucker at all. He was a twisted psychopath, hiding in plain sight inside the coroner's office. Frank's body went limp as the light left his eyes. At long last, the coroner released his iron grip and let Frank's body fall to the ground with a sickening thud. He straightened up slowly, a look of satisfaction on his face at another successful hunt. There would be no further interference in his gruesome operations. Without so much as a backward glance, the coroner strode away into the night, leaving Frank's lifeless body behind in the dirt. The demon who had hidden behind a uniform would kill again. But for now, Frank's tragic story had reached its end. My name's Hank, and I've been a trucker going on 20 years now. I've spent more nights than I can count driving the back highways across this country. Just me and the long, open road ahead. When people ask me about my job, they think it's all just sitting alone, bored out of your mind. But there's a lot strange stuff that happens out there in the darkness, things you need to see to believe. Some nights still give me the chills thinking back on them. I've seen things from my cab I won't ever be able to explain. But the night I still have the hardest time getting out of my head was in the winter of '97 coming through Nebraska. The snow had been coming down heavy for hours, beating on the windshield steady like a drum. The roads were just black ice at that point and traffic had all but disappeared. Most folks had taken shelter for the night, leaving me the only idiot still driving down that frozen highway. I had a delivery to make on time in Iowa, so the weather wasn't stopping me no matter how bad she got. White-knuckling the wheel, I squinted out into the sea of snow, not able to see but maybe 20 feet ahead. My radio had gone to static about 50 miles back, and the silence made me uneasy. Other than the roar of my engine, it was like the whole world around me had vanished. Even my headlights barely cut through the heavy snowfall as I crawled along at 15 miles per hour. I was just focused on staying on the road when, through the storm, I spotted someone walking alone down the shoulder. I tapped my brakes out of reflex, though there was no way I was stopping way out here for some crazy hitchhiker in this mess. At first, I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks. As I got closer, I saw it was a young woman stumbling along. She was wearing nothing but a ripped-up nightgown, soaked through, no shoes, arms wrapped around herself, shivering. What the hell was she doing out in this blizzard all by herself, I wondered. Every sensible voice told me to keep going, just call emergency services once I got to a phone. But something about the way she looked made me pull over against my better judgment. I cut the engine and stepped down into 6 inches of fresh fallen snow, the flakes stinging like needles on my skin. At the sound of my door, she whipped around startled. Even through the storm, I could see she was terrified as she backed away from me like a cornered stray. I raised my hands and called out that I only wanted to help and get her somewhere warm, but she wouldn't make eye contact. Slowly, I convinced her to take my coat and come inside the cab to thaw out and explain what happened. In the cab, I got the heat blasting as she huddled shaking on the passenger seat. Still wary of me, she seemed in shock, barely mumbling one-word answers as I pressed her for any info. All she managed was that her name was Ellen, and that she needed to get far away from here. Now. The fear in her eyes convinced me not to push further. I figured she'd been through something awful, but right now she just needed warmth. I told her we'd go straight to the nearest police station once the storm passed. We drove on slow and quiet for maybe 20 more miles when suddenly I started to pick up something beyond the static on the radio. At first it sounded like voices under the white noise. I was stunned to hear a man talking calmly as if doing a report about escaping into the storm from some facility. The radio cut in and out until I made out the words, "Extremely dangerous psychiatric patient, escaped custody." My stomach dropped and I looked over at Ellen staring petrified at the radio. I tried to tune the signal but couldn't make out any more words before the static took over. "Was someone holding you somewhere against your will?" I asked. She went quiet, but her face said everything. I'd picked up an escaped mental patient. God only knew what she was capable of or what I had gotten myself into. The logical part of my brain said pull this rig over and get the hell away from her before things got worse. But looking at her shivering and terrified, I couldn't just abandon her if she was really running from some awful place that did her harm. My only choice was getting her to the police so they could sort out the facts and help her. I made her swear she wouldn't try anything crazy, and when she nodded, I decided we would ride out the storm together. The snow was letting up some by the time the interstate into Des Moines came into view. I was starting to let my guard down, thinking we were in the clear, when Ellen suddenly started shouting frantically for me to pull over. She sounded panicked, saying we were being followed, and they were coming to take her. I checked the mirrors, but the road behind us was desolate. To calm her, I assured her we were alone and would be at the station soon. But it wasn't 30 seconds later that a set of blinding headlights emerged from the inky darkness behind us, barreling up the highway at breakneck speed. Ellen began screaming and flailing, certain it was them, that they had somehow found and tracked her down. I still tried convincing myself she was just confused and it was merely some random passing car. But as the vehicle dangerously closed the gap, I noticed it was an ominous black van, tailgating us perilously close. My gut twisted into knots when suddenly their high beams flicked on, nearly blinding me through the mirrors. I struggled to see the road as my mind raced. Who the hell were these guys in the van, and how in God's name did they know our exact location? It was clear now there was no possible way I could safely pull over and let them take Ellen, not with her screeching and wailing hysterically that they had come to kill her. Considering the lengths they had gone to pursue us, I figured they likely had no problem killing us both. My only choice left was to lose them or die trying. I slammed the pedal flat to the floor and the semi's engine roared in protest as we surged forward. But the van easily kept pace, swerving wildly from side to side trying to overtake us. My lumbering rig was no handling match for the speed and maneuverability of that van on the snow-slicked road. I knew if I didn't manage to shake them quickly, we were both as good as dead. 2 more lost souls disappearing forever into the cold, dark oblivion of the Nebraska highway. My mind raced desperately, grasping for any possible way to escape from the relentless van shadowing us. They were determined not to let us get away. As if to prove the point, they suddenly rammed the rear corner of my trailer, nearly sending us into a deadly spin-out. It was then, through the panic, that I spotted a glowing exit sign ahead for a small, rural truck stop and service center, maybe half a mile farther down the road. In that instant, I realized it was likely our sole chance of getting out of this nightmare alive. I warned Ellen to brace herself as I sent us fishtailing recklessly towards that exit at over 75 miles per hour. The van stayed glued to our rear, clipping the back fender and struggling to maintain contact as we hurtled toward the glowing salvation of the rest stop. I didn't even consider slowing down until we finally jerked to a tire-screeching stop, taking cover under the lights and amongst the few parked trucks. Unable to brake in time, the black van roared past us, disappearing into the darkness ahead. I sat there panting, heartbeat throbbing in my ears as I anxiously peered out into the gloom, waiting for any sign of their headlights reappearing. Next to me, Ellen was bent forward, her face buried in her arms as she sobbed heavily, overwhelmed with relief that we had somehow escaped them. After endless, tense minutes with still no van returning, I slowly stepped outside on shaky legs, desperate now to summon help before they came back. I had absolutely no idea who these ruthless people after Ellen were, or why they wanted her so badly. But we had managed to evade them, at least for now. Getting her to police quickly and telling them everything was the only shred of hope either of us had left. This whole mess had gone far beyond just helping a stranger along some snowy highway. That terrifying encounter was genuinely the very first time in my life I truly realized that some people in this world are capable of astonishing cruelty and evil. Ellen ended up in protective custody once the authorities were involved. She likely saved my own life that night. The police informed me those vicious men in the van almost certainly would have killed me in cold blood once they finished with her. Still gives me chills remembering that black van bearing down on us out of the darkness, absolutely relentless. Sometimes being a decent Samaritan and stopping to help can lead you down an unexpectedly dark road you never bargained for. Because out here alone on these endless highways, winding through the shadows each night, you honestly never know where the road ahead might ultimately take you, or what might be coming up fast to meet you on your journey.